There is a brutal truth that separates two worlds, the world of the dreamer and the world of the doer. That truth is not talent, it is not luck, it is not genius. It is discipline. Discipline is the brutal, unapologetic, relentless force that separates the ghost of potential from the reality of power. It is the choice to show up when it hurts, to keep going when the work feels pointless, and to understand that victories are not given, they are taken by the unapologetic and the relentless. A small, consistent action is what stacks into a destiny. One single extra rep when the muscles are screaming, one early morning claimed from the jaws of comfort, one turned-down distraction in a world designed to addict. That is the entire formula. That is how legends are forged, not born. They are built in the silence of these small, brutal choices, made day after day with relentless consistency. A future is not a dream, it is a construction project, and these are the only bricks that matter. Stop waiting for permission that will never come. Stop waiting for a perfect timing that does not exist. The universe does not send a formal invitation to begin. A start is made with one single committed habit, a commitment made without drama, without announcement. And a life will begin to rearrange itself around that commitment. Competence is not a gift. It is the direct, inevitable, ruthless result of that unapologetic choice to start now with what is at hand. Discipline must become a lifestyle, not just a sermon, not something to be talked about, but something to be lived. When the habits become automatic, second nature, the real war becomes clear. The enemies are not external. They are the doubt, the distraction, the cowardice in the mind. That is the only battlefield that matters, and discipline is the only weapon that works there. Unapologetic, relentless, absolute.
The raw pain of discipline is always temporary. The ache in the muscles, the fatigue in the mind, it passes. But the pain of regret is permanent. It is a ghost that haunts. It is a lifelong shame for what was not done, for the potential that was squandered for a little more comfort. A choice must be made between these two pains. Endure the short, sharp hurt of the effort now, or carry the dull, heavy, endless ache of regret forever. Be unapologetic about that choice. Choose the hard path every single time. Comfort is a beautiful, seductive, and deadly liar. It promises peace, but it delivers stagnation. Progress demands a sacrifice. It demands a blood price. And greatness only waits for the disciplined few, the ones who are willing to endure the brutal path, the ones who understand that the obstacle is the way. Relentlessly choose the path of most resistance, because that is the only path where strength is forged.
The excuses are just paper shields. They are worthless. They will not stop a single arrow from the real world. Burn them with the fire of a daily, brutal routine. Embrace the glorious, painful, beautiful grind. A future self is being built right now, and that future self will either be a monument to strength or a testament to weakness. Refuse weakness. Unapologetic, relentless, ruthless, steadfast. Waking up early is not about magic. It is a cold, hard declaration of war, a declaration that one is willing to outwork the world, to claim the silent golden hours of the dawn, and to forge progress in the absolute stillness while the competition is still asleep, dreaming of victory. The victory is not in the dream, It is in the relentless, unapologetic action taken in the dark, before the rest of the world has even started their day.
Swap the mindless scroll for a focused study. Swap the late-night escapism for a sunrise routine. Swap the endless excuses for a brutal execution. These are the small, daily trades that become the currency of a winning life. A life is not changed in one grand sweeping gesture. It is changed in 1,000 of these small, relentless, unapologetic trades, made day after day until they become an identity. Action must crush all hesitation. Do the ugly, boring, thankless work now, so that the rest of a life is not a monument to a graveyard of what-ifs and unfinished plans. Hesitation is the enemy. It is the assassin of momentum. The warrior acts on the 80% plan with 100% ferocity, while the scholar is still polishing the 100% plan and never leaving the library. The world belongs to the one who is in the arena, not the one in the stands with a perfect plan.
Every single time, the easy route is resisted, a leveling up occurs, an internal promotion. These hard, brutal daily decisions compound over time into a fortress of confidence, into an arsenal of competence, into a life that commands respect, not because of words, but because of the undeniable evidence of the work. Relentlessly choose the hard path, and the character will become as hard as the path itself. Success is just a boring accumulation of tiny, ugly, unsexy choices made in total silence. The choice to do one more rep, to read one more page, to make one more call, to endure one more minute of the pain. These choices must be repeated relentlessly until the work itself becomes the only language that is spoken, the only identity that is real. A person becomes what they do every day, unapologetic.
Stop chasing the shortcuts and the sparkly empty promises. They are mirages in the desert, designed for the desperate. There is no magic pill for real commitment. There is no secret hack for authentic strength. There is only the grind, the daily, brutal, beautiful, relentless showing up, and the stubborn, savage, unstoppable persistence to keep going no matter what. That is the only path, the only one. Be the one who gets to the real work while others are still dreaming. The world does not belong to the talented or the gifted. It belongs to the executors. It belongs to those who are willing to suffer the pain of discipline gladly and who are willing to reap the reward of their effort patiently. Unapologetic and relentless. The dreamers talk about the mountain. The doers are halfway up the damn thing while the dreamers are still asleep.
A future self is not a hope or a wish. It is a direct, brutal, mathematical consequence of the choices that are being made today. Stop blaming the conditions, the past, the world. Start constructing the daily, unbreakable habits that refuse to surrender to the siren song of laziness. A life is a building, and the habits are the bricks. The quality of the bricks determines the strength of the building. Relentlessly lay strong bricks. Comfort is the silent killer of all human potential. Choose the path of discomfort on a daily basis. It is the chisel that sculpts the character. It is the fire that forges the resilience. It is the brutal, unforgiving process that separates the person who tries from the one who triumphs. The embrace of voluntary hardship is not a punishment. It is the highest form of self-respect, a relentless commitment to becoming more.
Discipline must become the backbone of a life, the unbreakable internal structure
that holds everything up. The choices that are made when no one is watching, when the applause is gone, when the motivation has faded. Those are the choices that will write a legacy. So show up, make the sacrifice, and keep moving forward. Unapologetic. Because the only audience that matters in those moments is the person in the mirror. Quit romanticizing the idea of comfort. Greatness is not born in a warm, soft, safe place. It is forged in the fire of sacrifice, in the dirt and the sweat of the ugly hours, and in the cold, hard, relentless application of discipline. Be unapologetic about the demands of the mission. Be relentless in the execution of the standard. Be the person the past self promised it would become. Unapologetic.
Discipline beats the hell out of motivation every single day of the week. Motivation is a feeling. It is a chemical state. It is fickle. It comes and it goes like the weather. Discipline is a contract, a sacred, unbreakable contract signed with the self. And it does not break under the pressure of a bad mood or a tired body. The professional does not wait for motivation. They execute the contract, ruthless, relentless, unapologetic. Let the struggle be the teacher. Embrace the glorious, painful, beautiful grind. Take the hard, uncertain, terrifying steps and sculpt a version of the self that is too solid to be shaken. A version that is forged in the fires of adversity and is therefore immune to the heat. This is not a process of addition. It is a process of subtraction, of chipping away everything that is weak, soft, and untrue, until only the unbreakable core remains. Relentless, unapologetic.
The dreamer fantasizes about the destination. The warrior falls in love with the journey, the hard, brutal, uncertain journey, because they know that the journey is the thing that makes them. The destination is just a byproduct, a temporary reward for the character that has been forged. The real prize is the person who is built along the way, the person who can endure, who can adapt, who can win. The excuses are a warm blanket on a cold morning. It feels good to pull them over the head, to hide from the brutal reality of the day. But that blanket will eventually suffocate all dreams. It will smother all potential. It will become a funeral shroud. The warrior throws off the blanket. They face the cold, harsh, beautiful reality of the morning, and they go to war against the part of themselves that wants to stay in bed. The hard path is a choice that is made again and again, not once, but 1,000 times a day, in the small, silent, invisible moments. The choice to eat the clean meal, the choice to do the extra rep, the choice to turn off the screen, the choice to face the fear. These are the votes that are cast for a life of strength or a life of weakness. The final tally is the destiny that is created. Relentlessly cast votes for strength. The world wants a person to be average. The algorithm wants a person to be a passive consumer. The culture wants a person to be comfortable and compliant. Every act of discipline is an act of rebellion, a declaration of war against the forces of mediocrity. It is a statement that a life will not be dictated by the defaults. It will be forged by a deliberate, conscious, powerful will, unapologetic in its ambition.
The price of discipline is paid up front, in the moment. The price of regret is paid for the rest of a life. One is an investment, the other is a debt. The wise person understands this brutal accounting, and they choose to pay the investment every single day, knowing that the dividends will be a life of freedom, a life of strength, a life of pride, a life without the ghost of regret. The work is the only thing that is real. The feelings are smoke. The thoughts are clouds. The intentions are vapor. The only thing that has substance, that has weight, is the physical, tangible, undeniable act of the work. The person who grounds their life in the reality of the work is a person who is building their house on bedrock. The person who grounds their life in the fantasy of their feelings is a person who is building their house on a cloud, and the storm is always coming.
So what is the choice today? The temporary comfort of the excuse or the permanent power of the discipline? The easy path back to the same place or the hard path to a new one? The person is the author of their own story, and the pen is in their hand right now. What will be written with the actions of today? A chapter of weakness or a chapter of strength? The choice is ruthless. The choice is unapologetic. The choice is relentless. The choice is now. Go write it. The grind is not a punishment. It is a privilege. It is the privilege of being able to build a new self, a stronger self, a better self. It is the privilege of the fight against the entropy of the universe, the fight against the weakness of the self, the fight for a life that matters. Embrace that fight. Love that fight, because that fight is the only thing that makes a life truly worth living. Stop talking about the person who will be and start being the person who is through the brutal, relentless, unapologetic execution of the daily, boring, powerful, beautiful work. The time for sermons is over. The time for action is now. The time for discipline is forever. Go to war.